I've known Peter Newman for about 35 years. We go back a long time when we were both sort of in the beginnings of the environment movement. I was probably the first person to work in the environment and a government level in the country because I took a position in the first environment department in Canberra in 1970. And in 1972 I became chief executive of the environment minister in Canberra, who was the first fully fledged environment minister, Moss Cass, and wrote laws. And after that I ran a couple of environment departments, worked for the UN Environment Program, ran the Commission for the Future, done a whole lot of other things since then, but I've been dedicated to this. I've done a lot of work internationally. I worked, I was one of 12 people who wrote the first framework convention on climate change and biodiversity at the Rio Earth Summit. And before that, 20 years before that, I was at the Stockholm Conference as an advisor. And before that, I was at a place called the FUNE Conference, which you've probably never heard of. FUNE was a very, very important meeting, F-O-U-N-E-X. Just put FUNE Declaration and read it. It was written by one Barbara Ward, who some of you might know, who's a great economist. I worked with her. And the FUNE Declaration was on environment and development. It was the first time they tried to put the concept of environment and development together as a concept, because at that time they were at war with each other. You can have development or you have environment, and this was the beginning of a whole series of intellectual changes that created what we now call sustainability. I still work in this field in all sorts of ways. I write, I give talks, and I'm trying to create a theoretical base for sustainability, which I'm going to share some of it with you today. A lot is in that book. There's a new book called Destination 2050, and there's also a paper in the latest issue of the Journal of Future Studies, which is a 6,000-word essay on a sustainable society, planetary sustainable society. So I'm leaving copies of that. Peter has an electronic copy of that. So there's a whole lot of things I'm going to leave behind. I'm going to leave this PowerPoint slideshow, which has about 80 slides on it, which I'll cover about maybe 5 or 6 today only. So let's talk. 2050. I don't plan to be around in 2050. I would love to be here, but I don't think I will make it. But that's okay. A lot of you will be. So this is part of my legacy for you people, to think about the nature of 2050. You know, we're having a global conversation about the year 2050. That's 2 generations hence. We're saying, how do we create a climate-safe world by 2050? What levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere should we reach? So 2050 is kind of an endpoint conversation. Another example of the sort of thing we're doing is we're talking about population policy in this country and migration rate and what the consequences for our population levels in 2050. So, and now if you see, you just put 2050 into Google, you get all this stuff up, people having global conversations about the year 2050. You know, that's as 2 generations, not only what will be the consequences in 2050, what should or could be the future in 2050, and they're fundamentally different issues, aren't they? So the fact that we're having that conversation is almost a miracle, because humanity is not famous for being far-sighted and looking and planning 2 generations ahead. It's not something we've done, but we're now doing it. And we're being forced to do it in a collaborative way, because if you think about the nature of climate change, for example, all of us got probably pretty depressed by the outcomes of, say, the Copenhagen conference, right? And it was interesting that you look at the press at the time, they were talking about the Chinese won and the Americans lost. Win-loss, but many of us understood something deeper. We're all upset because we actually knew that we all lost. So the conversation changed between the 20th and 21st century is win-losses. We've left that back in the 20th century. We're now so interdependent, interconnected with a single planetary environment that we either all win together or we'll all lose together. There are only 2 choices left. And that's changing a force of a collaborative future for all of us. And that's because we're developing a whole base, which I'm going to talk about some length, about a value shift to the birth of a paradigm called planetism. Planetism is very simple. Tribalism is first allegiance to tribe. Nationalism is first allegiance to nation. Planetism is first allegiance to planet. Now, most of you will be planetists, yes? Yeah. Okay. Now, you've maybe not used that word before. Not long ago, I had an extraordinary opportunity to speak at a rock music festival called Golden Plains. There were 8,000 people between the ages of 18 and 30 there, most of them undergraduates from Melbourne and Sydney University, all the eastern universities. And I gave them that, said, put your hand up if you're a planetist, and 8,000 hands went up. It was just one of those moments I will never forget. These people said, what's the conversation? And that makes a nonsense of people who say, like John Howard said, we're not going to sign the Kyoto Protocol, it's not in the national interest. Yes, but I say it is in the planetary interest. So sometimes we have to make a choice where our first allegiance is. And this is a very fundamental issue to us. And it's what's coming out of these that 2050 conversations are about the entire planet. Just look at the number of times the word planet is used in newspapers. Today compared with 10 years ago, I think it's quadrupled at least. Okay? So, let's talk about 2050. Now, I want you to imagine, we cannot create a future which we do not first imagine. I want you to imagine that in 2050 we've created a global society that's prosperous, sustainable, harmonious, secure and just. 5 words. Okay? Now, I'm going to tell the story that we're actually halfway to inventing that, even though we didn't know it. A lot of my work is about looking on trend analysis. I'm going to tell that narrative shortly. But the very fact is, what are the products and services we need to create? What are the ideas transformations? What are the value systems we need to hold? What kind of collaborations? And how are we going to finance that, for example? We have to create new mechanisms to finance. Can we do that? The answer is yes. And that book is 500 pages of telling you how to do it. So the point about it is, I spent my years as a senior bureaucrat. In my life, I've written nearly 500 cabinet submissions. And what that means is I spent a lot of time taking a big idea, shrinking it down into something that a government can do or a company can do. And to say, we need this and this and this and this, we need to spend that much money, and here's the upsides and downsides politically, and so on. So 2050 as a journey like the Apollo mission. When John Kennedy said we're going to go to the moon and back again, no one had a clue how to do it. But America invented its way there. That's the power of vision, if people think it's a worthy vision. So my work is now about convincing people not only is this a worthy thing to aspire for, but it's a very plausible way to pay for it, and actually we're we're probably nearly 50% there already. Okay? Now, my definition of a society that has all those 5 characteristics is what I call a sustainable society. It's something we can live on forever. And my book, subtitled Designing 2050, is Pathways to Sustainable Prosperity on Spaceship Earth. Sustainable prosperity are words that I have put together because I've done a lot of work. I've basically looked at things like the John Elkington's triple bottom line, and basically it doesn't work really very well. As a reporting mechanism, it's so-so, but it's not changing behaviour in a significant way. And it's just we get change behavioural shifts. So my concept of sustainable prosperity, I'll talk about that now. And there's a series of new ideas and new word sets I'm going to introduce, which I've used so I can get my message across. One of them is the concept of sustainable prosperity. We can have economic prosperity and we can have economic poverty. We can also have ecological prosperity and poverty, and social prosperity and poverty, and cultural prosperity and poverty. If I cut down an old growth forest, I might create some economic prosperity at the cost of ecological poverty, yes? If I leave it there untouched, I might retain some ecological prosperity and create some economic poverty. The art form is how do we create simultaneous prosperity in all of them? In the Northern Territory, I might put a mine there. I might give jobs to Indigenous people and create some social prosperity in terms of mobility and aspirational incomes, but might decimate their culture. So we might create social prosperity and cultural poverty simultaneously. So my work is not to take things like natural capital and human capital and manufactured capital and financial capital. They're all inputs. Sustainability is about outputs, is it not, of things we do. So I've used the words poverty and prosperity as 2 words to define outputs from all the things we do. Can we imagine creating simultaneous prosperity in all 4 of those? The answer is yes, but we have to invent the way there. So I'm creating ideas and concepts. To do that, we have to invent a whole new sets of products and services that we can't imagine. So how can we imagine the products and services that we need to create between now and 2050 to create a sustainable society in ways that we understand them today, even though they haven't yet been invented? And to do that, I use a concept of what I call ways and wheres. Ways are the changes in behaviour, behavioural shifts, and where's the changes in things, changes in what we do, what we do, and where's are the changes in what we use. So a water conservation way would be shortening your shower from 6 to 3 minutes. And a water conservation where would be a low volume shower head. Together they create water conservation. See how it works? And we can create a whole host of new ways and wheres. In the ecological system, we can have ways and wheres to live within perpetual solar income. Now, Buckminster Fuller created that phrase. 10,000 times more energy arriving on the sun, from the sun every day than we could ever use. But we would know the people who create the ways and wheres to help us live within perpetual solar income just might become 21st century billionaires. And we have to learn to turn waste into food. In nature, there's no such thing as waste. The excrement of one animal is the food for another. So can we create the ways and wheres to turn waste into food? So we abolish the concept of waste altogether. And I'll give you a third one. There's 5 of them. I'll come back to these a bit later in my talk. We have to create zero net collateral damage. Sustainability is about precision. It means we actually do something wrong that we didn't mean to do. And collateral damage, of course, comes out of the defence sector, which says we meant to bomb that Taliban house, but we unfortunately knocked off the school next door and killed a whole pile of kids. But in sustainable, we can use that in agricultural terms, in medical terms. For example, in medical terms, chemotherapy causes a lot of collateral damage. But sustainable medicine involves finding a new way, a new set of enzymes, or biotechnological systems that take out the cancer and leave the rest of the body completely untouched. That's sustainable medicine. Or in agriculture, I put the pesticide on the crop. It kills the bugs I meant to kill. It kills the bugs I didn't mean to kill. The fish and swans in the river, sometimes the person in the plane putting the pesticide on. But if we can take a new form of predator control, biological control, or even a piece of gene technology, and we can take out the pests we want to take out and leave the rest of the world untouched, that's sustainable agriculture. So ways and wheres for that. So I'm beginning to talk about the 21st century economy already in terms of new things to do to create, in this case, ecological prosperity. So far, so good? Now let's talk about the journey to 2050. I'm going to give you a narrative which is the story of the last 40 years and of the next 40 years through to 2050. In the paper I've written in the Journal of Future Studies, and in my book and a pile of other things you can get on the internet, I've done a huge trend analysis of about 17 to 20 big global trends. They're all listed. I'm not going to go into them. I'm going to take those trends and turn them into a narrative, a story. Back in the mid-19th century, we were at the birth of the world of modernity. Modernity meant civilising the rest of the planet, if you happen to be Western European. That means you actually... and we did it combined with imperialism. We ran over the top of indigenous peoples. Progress meant everything new was good and everything old was, quote, old-fashioned and therefore out. Okay? That drove the system, the idea system, and it was married to a concept which was deeply entrenched in our culture called progress. Now, you might reflect, some of you would remember, older ones, we used to have these things called progress associations. All gone today, not one of them left. And because my father's generation said, you can't stop progress. Progress by definition was good. You can't stop. Joni Mitchell had a famous song in 1970 called Big Yellow Taxi. She talked about paving paradise and putting up a parking lot. Oh, progress is sometimes very bad. The idea that progress is bad was new. Because progress by... So at that moment we went from modernity... Well, we had modernity where everything was good to post-modernity. Post-modernity said, yes, there's a lot of old things are good, as well as new things are good. So postmodern medicine, for example, means that you as a postmodern person go to your doctor. The doctor says, well, here's what's wrong with you. Let's go to the chemist and get your prescription and take it. But you said, well, I might check out the Ayurvedic doctor or the Tai Chi Chuan person or the shiatsu person. We all know, or yoga, the world's cultures have all these incredible healing arts and science. As a postmodern person, you customise your own healing solution by combining the new with pieces of the old. That's classical postmodernity. If that doctor says all that other stuff's quackery, he's the unreconstructed modernist. Okay? So we are now postmodern people. We say old things have good, and we brought a whole lot of things back. And we've also looked at what we did in modernist era, and with some increasing shame. And we had to change the language which we used. What we used to call swamps became wetlands. What we call slums became heritage precincts. The very fact that we recognised, my God, I can't believe we knocked down that building. And so rather than knocking down buildings and creating functional monstrosities, we're attempting to take a heritage building, and this is a great street here, and retrofitting it with 21st century technology and shapes. And that's classical postmodernity, combining the best of the old and the best of the new. But postmodernity is just a halfway house between the big paradigm of modernism and what follows. It's like, if you know, you understand a cultural shift, we had a thing called the Baroque, and then we had a thing called the Rococo, and then we went into the modern era. The Rococo was the little extreme pieces of the Baroque before, and was an interregnum paradigm between two big paradigm shifts. My view is the big paradigm is planetism. Planetism says first allegiance to planet. The educated middle classes of the world believe this today. There's 1.5 billion of them, and the educated middle class, because of globalization, is increasing at the population of New York City every 3 months. And educated middle class people, whether it doesn't matter where they live, believe in 2 kids, they believe going to university, they believe in democracy, they believe in sustainability. Differences, but core, and that is now affirming public opinion. Well, planetism was predicted a long time ago. As a matter of fact, my first hit was 1624. John Donne, in his famous devotion, said, "No man is an island entire of itself. Every man is part of a continent, part of the main. If a clod be washed away by the sea, Europe is the less, as much if a promontory were, as much as this state of my friends and mine own were. Any man's death diminishes me, because I am involved in mankind, and therefore never sent to know for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee." Now, we all feel like John Donne. We look what's happening in Syria and Egypt and so on, or Yemen. Or Libya. We get furious that these autocrats are killing their own people. We are involved in mankind. We are involved in mankind to say, 25 years ago, or even 50 to 25 years ago, we said, well, that's the Libyans' problem. We'll just let it solve it. This is none of our business. Indeed, the whole global political system was no internal interference in other people's affairs. And the Chinese still promote this view, because they're still unreconstructed modernists today. All those teetering towards postmodernism are not quite there yet. Now, the important point about this is very fundamental to the whole way we think about the planet and the planetary society and the value system shift, because you see, if we can understand what the values of planetism are, and I'm going to talk about that, values define what is valuable and what is valued. What is valuable and is valued, we will want more of and create products and services for. Yes? Okay? So if I understand the dominant values of a planetist world, I can predict what products and services will be demanded by the markets and be produced and created. And some of them will be like turning waste in waste for turning waste into food, and so on. But also intercultural harmony, democracy. Let me talk about democracy for 1 minute. I worked with the Electoral Commission last year on the future of democracy. And I pointed out to them that at the end of the Second World War, there were just 10 fully fledged democracies on the planet. There's now 130. Some of them not so fully fledged, but all trying to be democracies, even though they don't quite know how to do it. The Egyptians don't know how to do it. The Libyans don't know how to do it. We're going to need help. Now, success goes to those who get to the future first. So we're good at democracy, so I suggested that we need to create an export industry in democracy. And export democracy ways and wares to the planet, like free and fair elections to the planet. Could you believe that democracy now has become an export industry in the 21st century? Right? It makes sense to you? I've just suggested something that you actually all know as educated middle class people. That's absolutely the way to go. So what are new opportunities? What people need? And let's talk about the paradigm of planetism. Before I do that, I want to talk about a few other things. The 19th century was the century of dependence. Most of us lived in colonies. And the word dependencies was used widely through the imperialist world of the 19th century. Okay? Dependencies. Now, over time, more and more countries became independent. So throughout the 20th century, massive improvements in independence movements. And that's going on today as we look at Syria and Libya today. Okay? The Arab Spring. And we all think the Arab Spring is fantastic. Who's on the side of the autocrats? Nobody. Nobody. We've all made... So there's a thing now called global public opinion, which says this is the way it's got to be. And we are all involved in mankind saying this is the way we think it ought to be. And you know something? We're shaping the entire planet now with our ideas, and they're shaping the marketplace because we think these things are valuable and we have to create products and services for them. So, the 21st century is about interdependence. Interdependence. Now let's talk about that. Globalization. Organised interdependence. We're becoming more involved in trading with each other. Today, about 30% of the products and services in the world today cross an international boundary between when they're made and when they're, quote, consumed. Going up about 5% per decade. That's one big change. And it's lifting people out of poverty in incredible levels. Not a perfect system, but my golly, globalisation is lifting. So the biggest global, the middle class of China plus India today is now 500 million. And it would be 1 billion in it's probably 15 years. Okay? And they are global middle class people who basically want the same things that we do, particularly if they're educated, and most middle class people are educated because not only we have the prosperity of globalisation, but the blooming of mass education. Not only reaching more and more people, but being deeper and keeping people in live jobs, so more people are reaching tertiary education at any time in human history by a huge people. And most people now have family members who are reached tertiary education, sometimes for the first time in the family's history. But that's a fact. And once you come out of university, you think like a planetist. You just do. Because you understand a bit about the world in a whole lot of ways we don't. So we've gone from interdependence. Now, interdependence is a critical word. I would suggest it's the most important word of the 21st century. Interdependence means that we are so interdependent now, we will either all win or lose together. Interdependence drove the creation of the European community, the European Union. When France and Germany said we can't afford ever to go to war together, we have to own so much each other's economies and our lives that we can't actually separate us anymore. We can celebrate our cultures in a new way, all right? Doesn't mean you not cease to be French or German, but you're French and German in a new way. And that's leading to the second big change besides globalisation, which are called tribalization. Have you noticed while we're coming together, we're falling into smaller bits? The old Soviet Union is now 15 separate countries. The old Yugoslavia, and that was the Russian Empire, which all the other ones were oppressed. The Serbian Empire, which is, quote, Yugoslavia, is now 7, with Montenegro and Kosovo becoming independent in the last 2 years. To our north, we have the Javanese Empire of Indonesia. The Timorese have become free, and everyone was on the side of Timorese. But Aceh would like to become free. So would West Papua, and a whole lot of others. And our public opinion was on the side of the East Timorese. And to our north, we have the Han Empire of China. Now, no one's, quote, free from China yet. But we all think the Tibetans are right, and the Uyghurs are probably right, and the Manchurians and the Mongolians are not far behind. The Hans are still oppressing, and we disapprove of the Chinese who oppress these minority groups. They produce some of their educated middle-class people because they're planetists before their time. They don't allow planetism there anymore because they're still modernists themselves. They haven't quite caught up. But the important point is we support Tibetan independence, we support East Timorese independence. And in Europe, I can predict Scotland will break off from Great Britain. Why? If you're Scottish, why should you take orders from London when the power resides in Brussels? You just bypass it. But that will lead to the Tyrol and Catalonia. Europe will break into lots of pieces, but they'll all come together as part of the European community. So you have the important thing is as you're becoming separate, you're actually becoming independent. So the Lithuanians used to be dependent on Russia. For 7 years only, they became independent, and then they joined the European Union and became interdependent. And that's growing up. Dependent children, independent adolescents, interdependent adults. And we all know the most sophisticated relationship we need in life, hard to manage, is the interdependent relationship. And interdependent relationships have several characteristics. First of all, they're about reciprocity, equality, and people coming together. like in a marriage or any other form of relationship. And it's all about two people giving some of their independence because of the bonuses and the benefit that comes from interdependence. Okay? You're gaining something from being interdependent, even though you're giving up some of your individual rights because of the collective power and blessings that flow from a relationship. And that's the important thing about all relationships. And that's a loyalty scheme with Qantas. That's a supply chain. All corporates today want long-term relationships with their customers, with their suppliers. They just don't want to go around and compete in the market. They want collaboration, interdependent collaboration where we mutually benefit. This idea that we have to collect, and this was predicted a long time ago in an essay that many of you will know, The Tragedy of the Commons by Garrett Hardin. And he talked about the big story, the big thing we have to achieve is what forms of mutual coercion can we mutually agree upon? Well, that's the banking crisis, that's climate change, and so on, right? We are all trying to have mutual coercion. That's the biggest story of the 21st century about all our relationships, whether that's a personal one, a business one, or a political union, or a global union. So interdependence is the core word of the 21st century, the most single important word, and we are now one world. Okay? Some of you will know Kenneth Boulding's famous essay from 1968 called The Economics of the Coming Spaceship Earth. If you don't, you should get it out and read it. He predicted that the world needed to go from what he called the cowboy to the spaceship economy. He didn't define those words, but I've spent the last 25 years of my life trying to define it. Okay? What we mean by the cowboy and the spaceship economy, and I was going to just bring that slide up in a minute. Okay? In 1969, Buckminster Fuller wrote a very fine book. Many of you would be Bucky fans, I'm sure. The book was called Operating Manual for Spaceship Earth. Both of those came out of the whole idea of the Apollo mission that the Earth was a single spaceship. This had been predicted earlier by Marshall McLuhan, who talked about the global village. And it was interesting that in 2000, Nelson Mandela said this: "Today we live in a global neighbourhood." And it's not in the interest of any of us that we have islands of plenty and seas of poverty. Above all, the challenge for the 21st century is the globalization of responsibility. But that's becoming involved in mankind. That's the whole, we are all now involved in mankind. We are in precedent giving money away to people we don't know through World Vision or to an earthquake in Haiti, whatever. The idea that we say, oh, that's their problem, that's gone. We are now all involved in mankind. So we are now inventing a single planetary society today. Okay? It's happening right around us. And that's going on as we become more and more. And we're creating all new sorts of, like the International Criminal Court. We needed one of those because they have these rogues and these planetary wicked people that are being unplanetary in their behaviour, and we have to punish them. So Colonel Gaddafi and Assad will certainly finish in the International Criminal Court, just as Milosevic and Mladic did. Inevitable and good. We can't let these people get away with this kind of thing because they are oppressing their own people. They're breaking up the kind of coalescence of the single global world. Is it not true that we're actually inventing a global society now, interconnected, interdependent? And the fact is we now realise that we have a single shared fate, which is of course created perfectly in the concept of our common future, which led up to the first Earth Summit, which I was lucky enough to work in. So that's the story so far. So what are the values of planetism? Now I'm going to bring up a slide here. I'm going to have to scroll through a few, but I'll find this how to work. Some of these things, I've talked about a lot of these things already, you see. Modernism challenged, interdependency, okay. We talked about a lot of these already. There's the interdependence, I just talked about that. There we are. Remember I talked about the cowboy and the spaceship economy. Okay? These are value shifts which I think are making. There are 9 value shifts here. That's important we understand them because they are defining what constitutes the global society. You might like to examine your own values to say, yeah, but briefly that's George W. Bush and that's Barack Obama. Okay? There was also Bill Clinton over here too. Okay? Now, individualism to communitarianism. Let's talk about that one. Communitarianism simply says that if rights are in conflict between the rights of individuals and the rights of communities, communities must win. Now, that's happening in Australia. For example, we're banning smoking in cafes because the community has the right to clean health, right? And we're taking guns off gun owners because the community has the right to safe communities. Now, these battles between community rights and individual rights are happening in many manifestations around the world today. So we're coming down a ton of bricks on these greedy, nasty Wall Street bankers who have fucked up the entire planetary financial system. They can't get allowed to get... These are rogues. I actually should think they should be sent to the International Criminal Court, myself, personally. But I also think that we not only talk about crimes against humanity, but crimes against nature. If somebody knocks off a pod of blue whales, they should go there too. I will predict they will be in the next 20 years. That will happen. Because we'll see these things are unplanetary behaviour. This is all crystallising belief systems, but those values here. So communitarianism is all about the rights of community are more important. The natural communitarians are the Singaporeans, for example. The natural individualists are the people of Los Angeles. And I remember about 5 years ago, Lee Kuan Yew went to UCLA and gave a speech. And it was called Human Rights, the Singapore Perspective. Of course, they always expect one to have a big laugh about this. But he said something, he got up and said one thing, and then he sat down. Well, a storm blew up, and then he got up and spoke. He said, I know you have human rights in Los Angeles, but in Singapore I can walk through a park at 3 o'clock in the morning safely and not get murdered. Can you do that in Los Angeles? He sat down. Now, this is a fundamental issue, isn't it? Okay? We have to restrict individual rights so we can have... And I have a definition now of what I call sustainable individualism. Sustainable individualism is individual behaviour that causes no collateral damage to others, or zero net collateral damage to others. So what we have to do is restricting, but that's what we're actually doing. We put people away for murder. Of course, that's collateral damage to others. But there's a whole lot of things which are less lethal than that, but constitute collateral damage. For example, a person... I remember this... Remember that woman about 3 years ago who won a huge payout from the tobacco companies for calling her lung cancer? And they went back and it was reversed. I actually was on the side of the tobacco companies, which surprised me, because basically she has to accept responsibility for her own behaviour. And the simple fact was, if she gets a payout, we all finish up paying higher insurance. So in other words, unrestricted payouts means that we all finish up paying the collateral damage, the community bears the collateral damage with higher insurance premiums if courts give away bastards of money to individuals. That's a more subtle version of the same thing. So communitarianism is growing. Independence to interdependence. Well, I've talked about that. Independence is not treasured. So interdependence is now the critical thing. And finding ways to be interdependent and creating sustainable autocracy to democracy. I've talked about that one too. If you happen to be autocrat, you ain't popular. As a matter of fact, you're a dying species. And even now the Swiss banks, who have been courting their dictators' money for half a century or more, are forcing to cough up money because they know they can't get away with this anymore. Because Swiss banks are pretty nasty in that regard. Humanity against nature, humanity part of nature. Now, humanity part of nature is the pre-modern view. That's the indigenous view. We've actually brought it back in the post-modern era. Is it true? And what? Okay. Production, consumption, lifestyles, development, unsustainable. That's a huge area, and I've talked a bit about that already. I've talked about living within solar income, turning waste into food and zero net collateral damage. I keep a couple of others, including mimicking nature. You had a person talking about the biophilia movement, but biomimicry, learning from nature. Learning from nature is clearly a part of the sustainable future. The things that works, as Janine Benua said in her book, Biomimicry. We have to learn from nature because they know how to do it. So designing with nature, learning from nature is another part. In my paper and in my work, I've actually listed these, and if I have time, I can go into that. Patriarchy to gender equality. Well, there's a few patriarchs around, but they're all on unacceptable behaviour, like autocrats. We don't approve of them anymore, whether they're the Taliban, whether they're some other kind of fundamentalist religious group. We say that is wrong. And we're actually doing some important things at the moment which are very divisive, like forcing Muslim women to take their burqas off. That's a classical individual versus communitarian issue, isn't it? Do the communities have the right to know that that person is not a man in disguise carrying a bomb around their belt, for example? And that issue of the individual versus the community is fundamental. The French are naturally more communitarian than the Americans. That would never be approved in America because they have so invested in individual rights. But the French are more, and the Germans are more communitarian naturally, as the Singaporeans are. They do that, and we're sort of caught in the middle here. We're sort of halfway between the Americans and the French. We can't decide whether we're individual or communitarian. We have some of both. The whole concept of mateship is clearly a communitarian concept. So we're torn. We don't know which way to do in that. We can't quite decide. The whole world has been communitarianised, and eventually that will be the way to go. I've talked about smoking in public and things like that. Intercultural and interreligious hostility, intolerance. Now these are big issues. Traditionally, we had tribal societies, which basically competed with each other. And but now we have to live on one planet. So we have to celebrate our tribal difference and our cultures in ways which do not endanger it. And you know something? We're inventing that way. Think about the concept of world music. World music is new. It's postmodern. It's a celebration of tribal music, but in concert which actually also celebrate the unity of humanity, does it not? So a manifestation, or what I call world food halls, another good example of that. You know them, you have a set of chairs and table in the middle, and around the side you have 15 different cuisines, and you go and I'll have a bit of that one, a bit of that one, a bit of that one. You know, 50 years ago, to eat somebody else's food was tribal treachery. We must never forget that. But now we said, wow, there's all this wonderful food that other people have. I'm going to customise my own pleasures by taking the best of all. Very postmodern, very planetist, okay? And before we used to solve our problems through confrontation and combat, and now we have to cooperate. And even we have a war now. We don't actually fight wars to the finish anymore. It's just about getting yourself in a position for bargaining, because the world is going to say, you are going to settle this by negotiation. So they have a fight until they get themselves in a best negotiating position for the negotiation. The old days, the idea that you actually had wars to the last person standing have gone. Okay? And down the bottom we have defence and security. I've done a lot of work for the Defence Department. I actually tell them all the time that they're a bunch of cowboys. You remember we used to have things like yellow perils and red hordes? The enemies were all out there. They're going to come and take us. But we now know we don't have a defence problem anymore. China's not a threat to us. We have a security problem. It's the Yakuza and the triads and the mafia putting heroin into our kids. Not some threat over there is going to come storm across the barracks and take our country. So we have a security problem. So security ways and wares is a huge area. And vigilance and security ways and ways involve better vigilance and better intelligence. And I've worked with security companies. So basically all these values are growing. And they're the values of planetism. Let me talk a couple about some smoking in public now in terms of a shifting value system, because I've done a lot of work with coal companies who keep telling me what's the future of coal. And I don't agree with the federal government that it's going to burn through the thing. It's not going to die as quickly as the Greens wanted, but it's not so going to grow like the Labor Party or the opposition say. It's somewhere in the middle. And but I say this to a coal company or to an oil company, and I've done them both. To burn a tonne of coal or a barrel of oil in the year 2025 and release climate-changing gases to the atmosphere and causing collateral damage to the planet is the moral equivalent of smoking in a cafe in 2011, and will cause outrage and be banned. And it's also the equivalent. So it's also equivalent to mining the Taj Mahal for the marble in it. Because if those who have any organic chemistry backgrounds would know the structures of carbon, organic carbon relations. I'm an old biochemist and organic chemist, so this is something I feel strongly about. We don't break it down into single molecules of carbon dioxide, throw it as a wasteland up there. And we need to think about redefining the way we think. Now, there's a whole set of issues around climate change. But everyone said, well, we're emitting too much. The problem is not too many emissions. The problem is too much carbon in the atmosphere. Now, if we think about the problem as being too much carbon in the atmosphere, I want you to think about a bath. The plug is out of the hole and the tap is running, and the level in the bath stays constant. And we've got to turn the tap off. We're trying to do that. But we can also make the plug hole bigger, can't we? And so if we define it that way, I'm promoting a concept which I call mining the sky. You know, we're going to have a price in carbon in 12 months' time of $23 to $30 a tonne. That means we can get $30 for every tonne of carbon we take out of the sky. Whether it's by photosynthesis or by some new industrial processes I'm actually working with and people on. To actually say, you see, we define the problem as too many emissions. But if we define the problem as too much carbon in the atmosphere and going up, we say, well, we can take carbon out of the atmosphere. And now it's like a gold rush in Ballarat in 1850. There was a price put on gold. It was in a pile of rocks surrounded by a lot of quartz, and people went mad digging it up and bringing it in and selling it. Well, we now have all this carbon. Can you imagine a carbon rush into the sky? Yeah? So there's a whole set of issues now which we have, a lot of us define about the way we perceive things. Now, I talked about sustainable prosperity and I've talked about ways and wheres, but around the ways and wheres, this book here, my big book, has hundreds and hundreds of ways and wheres to do all these sorts of things, because they are the things we need, which we're going to provide for a planetary society in the year 2050. Now, if you want to believe that, just go through this exercise. If you were commander of a spaceship, with a multicultural and bi-gender crew on a 10-year voyage, what are the set of rules you would have to make sure you got to your mission completely? So they didn't fight amongst each other or destroy the spaceship. They'd be basically these rules. Okay? They'd be basically these rules. So we are now in a planetary spaceship, as was pointed out by Kenneth Boulding and Bucky Fuller back in the 1960s. And this idea has gone out of fashion a bit. I'm actually trying to bring it back because it's a very strong concept. That we're all condemned to live on this spaceship. We can't make a mess of our spaceship home. Okay. And out of this we can create a whole set of products and services which are all about that. And you know, the 21st century economy wants more gender equality, more sustainability, more democracy. Interdependence. Let's take a look at that one. Farouk Hussein works for Debbie, as I do, which is a whole high-tech company, a part of Curtin University, which is directed towards software, but it's all about connection, interdependence, because the world, you see, my view is that Marshall McLuhan, when he talked about the global village, was right. You see, traditionally we evolved in caves, in groups of about 15, then we moved into villages, and there are about 500 there, and we lived for millennia like that. Okay? So we're genetically programmed to be intimate with about 15 people and to be close friends with 500. It's no accident every sporting team, former sporting team, has a number between about 8 and 20. Australian football, I think, is one of the higher end at 18. So it's no accident that our sporting team, we don't have sporting teams with 65 or 70 people in each team, do we? We have smaller groups. And because it's team spirits, we're programmed that way biologically.
The swimming team's quite big.
What?
The Australian swimming team's quite big.
Yeah, but yes, they are, but they're all competing individuals as part of the village. See, I talk about the village of 500 people. They're not 500.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, I still see the whole point about that is, so all of that is what we're creating now. And so the important point about this is the whole nature of the 21st century we can actually invent. Now, my point is we're actually all halfway there to doing this, because most of the things you want to do is, so what I'm trying to commit is the emerging 21st century economy. We're providing the ways and wheres for these sorts of things. And that's all good news, because that's going to help us get to our destination 2050 of a harmonious, prosperous, sustainable, just and society. Okay? All the things I talked about. That's now happening. Okay? So my work is on about shifting paradigms and getting big pictures right. Now, I could list all the trends, more of this, less of that. It's in the paper, which is in the Journal of Future Studies, which is a 6,000-word essay on a sustainable society, which I'm making available to you. And it's also in my book, and my new book, which is called Destination 2050, which is only 100 pages, which I've just finished. And basically, that's the nature of the 21st century. I actually think it's all pretty good news. And I actually don't think there's any reason to despair. That doesn't mean we don't have to work hard. But you see, what we don't do is do that. And I want to finish with the last, how much time have I got left?
About 5 minutes.
Oh, 5. Quickly, we have to be future makers in all of this. The world is divided into future takers and future makers. And the future taker part of us is the manager part of us. And the future maker is the leader part of us. And my work, I do a lot of work on future making and taking and future shaping. There are 6 tools we use to shape the future: management, leadership, planning, design, innovation and learning. Okay? They are, and I do a lot of work on leadership and management. Managers respond to change, leaders create and shape change. Managers are concerned with doing the thing right, the leaders are concerned about doing the right thing. Managers are concerned about fate, leaders are concerned about destiny. Henry Ford said the secret to a successful life is to understand what is one's destiny to do. I would suggest your destiny is part to create 2050. You probably wouldn't be here otherwise. Because you're here because you know I'm a futurist with a green tinge to me. And that's probably said, yeah, that sounds pretty interesting. That's sort of where I am. So you are future, and the important point is to be the resilient future taker and the purposeful future maker. Now, the manager part of us is what I call the probable future. The manager part of us says, what will the future be like? What will it be like? The leader part of us is what I call the preferred future. What should or could it be like? And George Bernard Shaw said that beautifully. He said, some people see things as they are and ask why. I see things as they could be and ask why not. You know, the future is made by people who have dreams and make them come true. That's leadership of self, purposeful future making. And probable preferred future is a part of it, but also the manager part of us is a different kind of strategist to get to the future. They said, well, that's what's going to happen. That's the trend. How do I not get run over by that trend or make $1 out of that trend? I have to fix the problems. They're what I call problem-centered strategists. They move all the things which are going wrong so we can go on to that probable future. What if that probable future involves going over a cliff? And you see, if you are a probable futurist for going what will be and having a strategy to get there, which is problem-centered, which is removing the bads, you're only creating a future which is merely less awful. Not wonderful, not magnificent. To create a wonderful and magnificent future, you have to imagine one. We cannot work to create a future which we did not first imagine. But the leader part of each of us is the preferred futurist. What is my dream and how do I make it come true? And what's my destiny? My destiny is probably fulfilling your dream, but your destiny from insight tells you what you're good at, aptitude, what you love doing, passion. Do that, define your work around your destiny, what you love doing, because the jobs, kids ask me at university, well, the kids in year 9 say, what should I study at university? You're a futurist. I said, it doesn't matter what you study at university, it'll be no relationship to what you're doing when you're 35. Follow your passion, not your pension. Because the jobs that you're going to be doing when you're 35 have yet to be invented. So you might as well have a good focus on what your destiny, what you're good at and what you love doing. That defines your work, which gives meaning to your life, and the art forms to turn that into employment, generating dollars from it. That's what Henry Ford said. Henry Ford said the secret to a successful life is to understand what is one's destiny to do and to do it. And he imagined the future Henry Ford and said, well, I'm going to find a way to make a car that everyone can afford. He didn't set out to become a billionaire. He became one because he created a car that everyone could afford. You look at the whole history of entrepreneurship, it's about people having great dreams and making them come true. We need more planetary entrepreneurs, resilient future takers and purposeful future makers. The manager part of us, I've described. The leader part of it has the preferred future, what should or could the future be, and creates the mission-directed strategy to get there. The obstacles we need to remove, the improvements we need to make, the new initiatives we need to keep, and 2 important ones, the heritage we need to keep and the baggage we have to throw out. And that bottom bar, the heritage we need to keep, the things that matter, but all the other stuff in my life, and I'm working with a couple of big private schools in Melbourne on some projects, and they said, this is our heritage. I said, do you realise in the last 10 years your heritage has now become your baggage? It's preventing you changing. So, manager and leader, you're all both your future makers and future takers, but you must be a resilient future taker in this world and a purposeful future maker of Destination 2050. And I want to finish with 3 thoughts. We cannot work to create a future which we do not first imagine. I've said that once already. And Einstein said, imagination is more important than knowledge. The second one is, those who do not live in the future today will live in the past tomorrow. You see, What the leader part of us does, they walk into their future in their imagination, imagine the future self as hero, like Henry Ford did, and say, I'm going to do that. They come back to the present and make it happen. We need leaders of ourselves and purposeful future makers. Okay? And when we're creating not only intra-generational justice, but intergenerational justice. Finally, Ralph Waldo Emerson. Many of you will know his work, but he said this beautiful thing, which is really my mantra. He said, do not follow where the path may lead. Go instead where there is no path and leave a trail. Thank you.